My wife was gone. My infant son was barely breathing. And the very people who had ruthlessly ripped my world apart were still luxuriating in their gilded cages, utterly untouchable. I was shattered, drowning in a suffocating sea of grief and poverty, until a mysterious old man, his eyes piercing through my despair, pressed a crumpled piece of paper into my hand. His whisper ignited a dangerous, consuming fire deep within my soul. Call me when you truly need a way out. We'll make those people pay. My name is Darren Banner. And if you want to understand how I ended up sitting across from that enigmatic stranger, ready to wage war against an empire, then I need to take you back to where my fight truly began. I grew up in the Bronx, New York, a working-class neighborhood where the raw scent of machine oil and the constant roar of truck horns formed the soundtrack of our lives. Our small house, tucked away on a narrow, bustling street, bore the stains of time on its walls and a roof that wept with every downpour. My father, Tom Banner, was a handyman, his hands rough and calloused, yet incredibly skilled with a hammer. My mother, Dorothy, worked 2 grueling jobs just to keep our heads above water, teaching bright-eyed kids by day, waiting tables at a greasy diner by night. Our home was cramped, just a tiny living room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms where the wind often whistled through the worn-out corners. I remember evenings filled with my dad's stories from his worn armchair, while my mom's sweet lullabies filled the air. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And honestly, for us, that was everything. But even as a kid, I felt the harsh bite of the world. I was 8 years old when I first saw it up close. I went with my father to fix some plumbing at a sprawling mansion in an upscale neighborhood. The homeowner, a man in a glossy, expensive suit, looked at my dad like he was dirt on an imported rug. He berated him for being too slow, even though my father had been toiling tirelessly for hours. I stood there, my small fists clenched, a furious heat rushing to my face. My dad just bowed his head and kept working. But as we left, he gently took my hand. Darren, he said, his voice quiet but firm, as long as you stay honest and work hard, being poor is not a shame. Don't let them make you feel inferior. Those words etched themselves into my young soul. My mother echoed it, too, especially after a long, exhausting night shift. Her tired eyes still held a fierce, defiant spark. Education is the key, my dear boy. Study hard, and you'll change your life. Not just for you, but for us, too. I absorbed every single word. I swore I'd never let them make us bow to anyone again. I wanted my parents to live a comfortable life, free from the crushing worry about every penny, every medicine bill, every electricity charge. I dove into my studies like a man parched in a desert. At school, I was always at the top of my class. I didn't care when the rich kids mocked my hand-me-down clothes or my tattered backpack. I buried myself in books, in complex math problems, in literature, believing it was the only way out. Every night, I studied under a weak desk lamp, my mother often beside me, her proud smile a constant source of strength as she checked my homework. My father would bring home old books discarded by his clients, stacking them carefully in my room. Knowledge, he'd say, is something no one can ever take from you. But life wasn't just beautiful dreams. When I was 13, my mother fell seriously ill. A single week off work, and our meager savings vanished like smoke. My father worked day and night, but it wasn't enough for her medicine. So, I secretly went to a grocery store, begging for a job. The owner, a stern, unforgiving man, just sneered. "A poor kid like you? What do you think you can do?" I just bowed my head and left, a bitter taste in my mouth. But that night, as my mother hugged me, promising she'd get better, I made another vow: I would never let anyone look down on my family again. I would work, I would study, and one day, I would make them see us differently. At 16, I earned a scholarship to a prestigious high school. It was my first step into a foreign, glittering world. Kids driving their own cars, expensive uniforms, talking about European vacations like they were discussing groceries. I felt like a fish out of water, but I didn't falter. I studied relentlessly, proving myself every step of the way. Those relentless efforts landed me a university scholarship. College was even tougher, but I pushed through, graduating with an honors degree in finance from a top institution. The day I walked across that stage, my parents were there in the back row. My mother openly sobbed, and my father gripped my hand, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You," he whispered, "are our greatest pride." It wasn't just my diploma, it was ours. After graduation, I hit the job market, brimming with confidence. But each rejection letter was a gut punch. A recruiter once eyed my old, borrowed dress shirt. "Where are you from?" he asked, a subtle sneer in his voice. "The Bronx," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He just smiled faintly. "Thank you. We'll be in touch." I knew they'd never call. Then, a glimmer of hope. Sterling Group, a renowned financial conglomerate, accepted my application. I remember the interview day, my heart pounding, stepping into their towering Manhattan skyscraper. Gleaming glass, polished marble everywhere. I felt impossibly small, an outsider among expensive suits and financial jargon. But I summoned every ounce of courage, answering every question. They nodded. They took notes. And I was hired into the investment analysis department. The starting salary wasn't much, but for a kid from the Bronx, it was life-changing. My early days at Sterling Group were intense. I worked like a machine, first one in, last one out. I checked every number, analyzed every report with meticulous care. I had to prove I belonged. Slowly, I earned a reputation as the hardworking kid. Some colleagues even started asking me to review their reports. I felt a surge of pride, a sense of belonging. But the class prejudice, it was still as clear as day. Colleagues born into wealth, educated at Ivy League schools, were treated differently. They lunched at upscale restaurants, chatted casually about their yachts and Hamptons vacations. I ate my mother's home-cooked lunch quickly in the break room, trying to ignore the whispers, the condescending glances. One day, a colleague named Mark, the son of a prominent bank executive, smirked at me. "From the Bronx, huh? How'd you even get in here? Must be luck." I swallowed my anger, forced a smile, and just kept working. I knew emotions couldn't win here. Still, the job did change my life. I rented a small apartment near the office and started sending money home regularly. The first time I brought a new TV to our cramped Bronx house, my mother's eyes lit up, though she playfully scolded me. "Darren, you don't need to buy these things. As long as you're healthy, and do well, I'm happy." My father just patted my shoulder, his eyes brimming with quiet pride. I paid for my mom's medicine. I fixed the leaky roof. For the first time in years, I saw them truly smile. Their happiness, that was my fuel. It made every ounce of exhaustion, every condescending glance, every quiet insult worth it. I began to climb the ranks. From analyst, I was entrusted with bigger projects, joined meetings with major clients. My boss, Mr. Harris, a stern but fair man, once called me into his office. "Darren," he said, a rare warmth in his voice, "you've got what it takes. Don't let anyone hold you back." His words were a shot of adrenaline straight to my heart. I worked harder, learned constantly, and became a key player. Colleagues started to respect me. They stopped calling me the kid from the Bronx. But not everyone. The two sons of the company's chairman, Roy and Bill Sterling, made it painfully clear that class prejudice would never fade for them. Roy, the elder, was arrogance personified. Bill, the younger, was pure laziness masked by his family's powerful name. Both looked at me like I was a cockroach infesting their mansion. Once during a team meeting, Roy deliberately questioned my background. "Darren, I heard you grew up in the slums, right? How does someone like you end up at Sterling Group?" The room went silent. All eyes were on me. I smiled calmly, a steel resolve beneath my composure. "I got here through ability, Mr. Roy. How about you?" A few colleagues chuckled nervously. Roy didn't. From that moment, I knew I was a thorn in his side. But I didn't care. I kept working, visiting my parents on weekends, bringing groceries, telling them about my job. My mother would hug me tightly, praying for my safety. My father would retell old stories, reminding me that no matter how far I went, I was still the boy from the Bronx, raised in love. Then she walked in, and my entire world shifted on its axis. Ava Sterling, the only daughter of the chairman, Gregory Sterling himself. It was at the company's 50th anniversary gala. Amid a sea of polished suits and superficial smiles, Ava appeared in a simple green dress, a true beacon of light. I was in a corner, nursing an orange juice, trying desperately to blend in. But when her eyes, warm and curious, met mine, I felt a strange, undeniable warmth bloom in my chest. She walked over, her smile gentle, completely devoid of the usual Sterling arrogance. "You're Darren, right?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. I nodded, utterly flustered. We started talking. She asked about my work, my financial analysis. I was stunned by her sincerity. She wasn't like the rest of the Sterling family. No trace of Roy's disdain. No hint of Bill's lazy entitlement. She was intelligent, sharp, yet full of genuine emotion, as if she understood struggles I never spoke aloud. Our conversation lasted for hours, and I realized I had smiled more in that short time than in the entire past month. In the days that followed, we kept running into each other. Hallways, the cafeteria. She always found a way to talk. I tried to keep my distance, to protect myself from the inevitable heartbreak, but I couldn't resist her warmth, her genuine curiosity. We started meeting outside work, brief coffee breaks at a small cafe. Ava spoke of her dream to escape her family's gilded cage, and I, in turn, shared stories of my parents, our cramped house in the Bronx. I saw that she wasn't just a powerful dynasty's daughter. She was a free spirit yearning for authenticity, for something real. Love came like a gentle breeze, then intensified into a powerful, unstoppable current. I don't know the exact moment I fell for Ava. Maybe it was the day she grabbed my hand during a sudden downpour, laughing, her hair soaked as we ran for cover. "Darren," she'd said, her voice full of pure joy, "I love moments like this. No need to pretend, just being ourselves." In that moment, I knew my heart was hers, irrevocably. But I also knew this love wouldn't be easy. She was Gregory Sterling's daughter. I was just a kid from the slums. No matter how hard I worked, the divide felt impossible to bridge. Whispers about us quickly spread like wildfire through the company. Roy and Bill didn't hide their contempt. Roy cornered me in a hallway, his voice icy, venomous. "Who do you think you are, Darren? A slum kid dreaming of my sister? Don't make me teach you your place." I clenched my fists, struggling to stay calm, to keep my professional mask on. Inside, a storm of fury was brewing. Then my worst fear came true. One afternoon, Ava called me to a secluded park. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but strangely resolute. "Father knows about us," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her strength. "He said if I don't end things, he'll fire you. Not only that, he'll cut off all my financial support. Every penny." My blood ran cold. This was it, the direct, brutal threat. I knew Gregory Sterling was a man who would stop at nothing to protect his family's reputation, his precious legacy. But Ava gripped my hand, her touch grounding me. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice clear and defiant. "I don't care what they do. I love you, and I want to be with you." Her words melted my heart, yet filled me with a terrifying dread. I didn't want her to lose everything because of me. But she squeezed my hand tighter, looking into my eyes. "We'll get through this together, Darren. I believe in you." In that moment, I knew I couldn't turn back. I loved her, and I would fight for her, even if it meant facing the entire world. We decided to get married, defying all their objections. When I proposed, Ava hugged me, tears streaming down her face, but with a radiant, joyful smile. Having you is enough, she'd said. Truly, it is. The Sterling family, of course, did not agree. Gregory summoned me to his opulent office, a room that felt designed to dwarf and intimidate. You think you're worthy of my daughter, Darren? He asked, his voice slow, dripping with contempt, commanding. You don't belong in this world. If you persist, I'll make sure you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, everything. I stood tall, meeting his icy gaze. Sir, I love Ava, and I won't let anyone take her from me. 2 months later, we held our wedding in a small, simple, but profoundly warm church. Only a few close friends, my parents, and my relatives attended. My mother, in a modest but carefully chosen dress, hugged Ava tightly. You're the pride of our family, she'd said, tears in her eyes. Take care of my boy, okay? Ava burst into tears, embracing my mother with fierce loyalty. My father patted my shoulder, his eyes full of pride, but tinged with a deep, unspoken worry. Not a single member of the Sterling family showed up. No blessings. No acknowledgement. They saw our marriage as a stain, a disgrace. After the wedding, Ava and I moved into a small apartment in the suburbs. It wasn't luxurious, but it was ours. Every night, as she lay in my arms, I felt like the happiest man alive. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. Gregory Sterling wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily. The storm hit just a few weeks later. One morning, Mr. Harris, my boss, called me into his office. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with regret. Darren, he said, his voice slow and pained. You're fired. It's an order from above. I tried to intervene, but, no. One can go against Gregory Sterling. I stood there, feeling the floor collapse beneath me. I wasn't surprised, I'd anticipated Gregory's retaliation. But having the job I'd poured my sweat and tears into ripped away still cut like a knife, a brutal severance from the life I'd built. I went home, trying desperately to keep a calm face, but Ava always knew. She sat on the sofa, her eyes bright, but filled with concern. Darren, what's wrong? You're not okay. I sighed, pulled her into my arms, and told her everything. She held my hand, gripping it so tightly I could feel her heartbeat syncing with mine. We'll get through this, Darren, she said, her voice resolute. They can take your job, but they can't take our love. But the Sterling family wasn't done. Shortly after, Ava received a letter from her father. Her financial support, bank accounts, credit cards, even her inheritance, all cut off. You chose a filthy pauper, the letter read, its tone as cold and sharp as a blade. You will pay for your foolishness. Ava read it, her hands trembling, then tore it to pieces. They're not my family, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. You and your parents are my real family. I held her, trying desperately to hide the fear gnawing at my heart. I threw myself into finding a new job, sending applications everywhere. But every door slammed shut, not just closed, slammed. One recruiter was brutally blunt. Darren, you have a strong resume, but no one dares hire you. You've crossed the Sterlings. They have more power than you realize. I slowly realized Gregory had used his influence to blacklist me, to strangle my professional life. We survived on Ava's meager savings and small loans from my parents. But with each passing day, our future grew dimmer, choked by Gregory's shadow. Amid those crushing hardships, a spark of joy arrived. Unexpectedly, Ava was pregnant. When she told me in our tiny kitchen, it was as if the whole world lit up. I knelt down, hugged her, tears rolling down my cheeks. We're having a baby. Thank God, I whispered, choked with emotion. She smiled, placing my hand on her belly. A boy, she said, her eyes sparkling. I want to name him Tony, after my grandfather, the only person in my family who ever truly loved me. I nodded, feeling a surge of new, fierce strength. But that joy, too, was tragically short-lived. As Ava entered her 8th month, she began to weaken, exhausted, sometimes fainting without explanation. I rushed her to the hospital, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The doctor said she had a rare but dangerous pregnancy complication. "We'll do everything we can," they said, but I saw the deep unease in their eyes. I held Ava's hand, trying desperately to stay calm. Inside, a storm of terror raged. I couldn't lose her. I just couldn't. The day Ava went into labor, I stayed by her side, gripping her hand, praying with every ounce of faith I had left. Then the doctor pulled me aside, his voice trembling, broken. "Darren, we have a problem. Ava's condition is critical. We may only be able to save the mother or the child." My world seemed to collapse in on itself, all sound swallowed by a deafening roar in my ears. "Save Ava!" I nearly shouted, my voice breaking, raw with desperation. "Save my wife, please!" I rushed back to the delivery room. Ava lay there, pale, breathing faintly. She seemed to sense something. She struggled to open her eyes, her trembling hand reaching for mine, whispering, "Darren, you have to save our baby. Promise me you'll protect Tony." I shook my head, tears falling like rain, unable to accept losing her, unable to make such a choice. But Ava squeezed my hand tightly, her voice weak, fading, but resolute. "Let me do this for our child. You have to be strong for Tony." I collapsed beside her bed, sobbing like a child, my entire being shattering into a million pieces. Every second felt like a death sentence. Then the doctors made their final, agonizing decision. Tony was born. A tiny, healthy boy with clear, bright eyes, just like his mother's. But Ava, the woman I loved more than life itself, was gone forever. I sat motionless, holding Tony in my arms, feeling my heart shatter into irreparable fragments. She had sacrificed everything to give our son life, and I, helpless, could do nothing to save her. Ava's funeral took place on a rainy, desolate day. I stood by her coffin, a hollow shell of a man, trying with every fiber of my being not to break. My parents stood silently beside me, my mother cradling Tony, openly weeping. The Sterling family showed up too, but not to mourn. They came, not to grieve, but to gloat. Roy approached, his eyes full of pure, unadulterated contempt. "This is the result of your stupidity, Darren. That child is a stain on our filthy bloodline." Bill stood nearby, a cruel smirk plastered across his face. "You should get out of here before things get worse." Even Gregory, with his icy demeanor, looked at my parents, his words a venomous hiss. "Your family is a disgrace, raising a son who dared to taint the Sterling bloodline." My father bowed his head, holding my mother's hand, trying desperately to stay calm. My mother clutched Tony tighter, shielding him from their poison. I stood there, blood boiling, fists clenched, but utterly powerless. Deep within me, beneath the crushing grief, a fire began to burn. Not of hatred, but a burning, righteous fury. I swore I wouldn't let the Sterlings trample on the people I loved anymore. I would protect Tony. And I would make them pay for what they had done to Ava, to me, and to our family. After the funeral, I brought Tony back to my parents' small house in the Bronx. The apartment Ava and I had called home was now just a painful, empty memory. I couldn't afford it, nor could I bear to face the walls that still held her warmth. My parents welcomed us without a word of reproach, only silent hugs and sorrow-filled eyes. My mother, with her frail hands, cradled Tony and sang to him in the same clear voice she'd sung to me. My father quietly fixed up an old crib in the corner, the very one he'd made for me 30 years ago. "Stay here, Darren," he said, his voice slow but firm. "Family is for leaning on each other." But I knew I couldn't rely on them forever. They were aging, their health declining, their meager savings barely enough. I had to stand up. I had to find a way to provide for Tony and care for my parents. I started the job search again. I knew the Sterlings had ensured I wouldn't find any decent paying job in New York. So, I turned to odd jobs, delivering packages, waiting tables, even working as a night security guard at a supermarket. Every day, I left home before the sun rose and returned when Tony was already asleep in my mother's arms. The little money I earned was just enough for Tony's formula and to cover the utility bills. Some nights I sat by his crib, watching his tiny, innocent face, feeling an indescribable pain. Tony had Ava's eyes, bright, gentle, full of life. Every time I looked into them, it was as if Ava herself were reminding me, be strong for Tony. My life became an endless cycle of exhaustion and crushing disappointment. I worked 16 hours a day, but it was never enough. My mother started coughing more frequently, and my father, though he tried to hide it, couldn't conceal the back pain that plagued him. I selling a piece of my very heart. But I had no choice. Tony need Ed to eat. My parents needed to live. In my weakest moments, I questioned everything. Was I doing the right thing? I'd fought for love, defied all prejudice, but the devastating cost was Ava's life. And now I was dragging my entire family into this never-ending storm. Some nights, when Tony cried for milk I couldn't afford to buy right away, I sat in the corner of the kitchen, head buried in my hands, feeling more helpless than ever. I missed Ava, her brilliant smile, the way she held my hand and said we would overcome everything. But now she was gone, and I was left with Tony, a tiny, innocent child who depended entirely on me. An inner conflict gnawed at me. I loved Tony, loved my parents, but I couldn't bear the feeling that I was failing them. I longed to give Tony a better life, to let my parents finally rest, but I didn't know where to begin. Once, when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Dark circles under my eyes, disheveled hair, a gaunt face ravaged by exhaustion. Was this still the Darren that Ava loved? The man who swore to change his family's life? By the way, if you're still with me on this unbelievable journey, please make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. But amid that suffocating darkness, a faint spark still flickered. It was in my mother's smile, tired but warm, as she held Tony. It was in my father, who despite his pain, told me old stories to comfort me. And it was in Tony, only a few months old, grasping my finger and smiling a pure, innocent smile, just like Ava's. Those moments reminded me of my parents' teachings: integrity and resilience are things no one can ever take from you. I knew I couldn't give up. I started seeking out small opportunities, anything to get back on my feet. I took extra night shifts, enrolled in free online courses to refresh my financial knowledge. I didn't know how to confront the Sterling family, but I knew I couldn't let them win. The vow I made under the rain at Ava's funeral still burned, a fierce ember within me. And then one fateful evening, destiny knocked in a way I never expected. It was that dreary afternoon in the park. I had bought a sandwich in haste. Seeing a homeless old man huddled on a bench, my stomach tightened with empathy. Without thinking, I tore the sandwich in half and offered him a piece. He accepted it, his trembling hands contrasting with startlingly sharp eyes that seemed to see right through my very soul. Then, silently, he pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with a handwritten phone number. "Call me," he said, his voice low and enigmatic, "when you truly need a way out." I tucked the paper into my pocket, thinking it was just an odd gesture of gratitude. But when I returned home, utterly exhausted after a night shift, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. A way out. Something I craved more than anything. That night, I sat in my parents' small kitchen, the dim yellow light casting long shadows on the crumpled paper. Tony was fast asleep. My parents were in bed, but I knew my mother only slept in fits and starts to watch over him, while my father hid the constant back pain he felt while patching up our leaky roof. I saw their tired faces. I couldn't let them keep living like this. I couldn't let Tony grow up in the same grinding poverty I had. I picked up the phone, my fingers hesitating over the keys. Finally, I dialed the number, my heart pounding as if I were standing at a fateful crossroads. The phone rang a few times before a calm, deep voice answered. "I've been waiting for your call." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm Darren, I said. We met at the park. You told me to call when I needed a way out. The old man chuckled softly, a dry but not unkind sound. Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th Street, 10 a.m. Don't be late. Then he hung up, leaving me with a flood of questions and an eerie feeling, as if I had just stepped into a game whose rules I didn't yet know, but whose stakes I understood perfectly. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe, an old place with worn wooden tables and the faint aroma of roasted coffee. It was nearly empty. The old man was already there, tucked in a corner, wearing a gray coat and a woolen cap pulled low over half his face. But his eyes, sharp and resolute, held my gaze. I sat down across from him. Thank you for coming, Darren, he said, sliding a glass of water toward me. I know you're at rock bottom, but I also know you're the only one who can do what I couldn't. I stared at him, my heart racing. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. And why me? The old man smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with distant memories. He slowly removed his cap, revealing a weathered face etched with deep wrinkles. I am Arthur Sterling, he said, his voice steady but laden with emotion. The founder of Sterling Group. And Ava's grandfather. I brought home money, but it disappeared quickly into medicine, diapers, and mounting bills. Once, I had to sell the watch Ava had given me, a gift she bought with her last savings before her family cut her off. As I handed it to the buyer, it felt like I was. Felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Arthur Sterling, a name that existed only in distant company stories, a forgotten legend. Ava had spoken of him, the only person in her family who loved her unconditionally. My grandfather was the best person I ever knew, she'd once said, her eyes sparkling. But my father pushed him out. I never imagined I'd meet him, let alone that he'd appear in my life at this very moment. Arthur began to speak, his voice rising and falling like the pages of an old book being opened. He had built Sterling Group from nothing, with a dream of creating a lasting legacy for his family. But his own son, Gregory, and his daughter-in-law had brutally betrayed him. They tricked him into signing over his shares, slandered him, and ruthlessly forced him out of the company. I lost everything, Darren, he said, his gaze distant, haunted. The company, my honor, my family. But he never stopped watching. I knew about you from your time at Sterling Group. I saw your integrity, the way you loved Ava despite all prejudice. And when you lost her, I knew you were the only one with enough reason to take down Gregory. Arthur paused, then gave a faint, knowing smile. Our meeting in the park? It wasn't a coincidence. It was my way of reaching you. I sat there, trying to process his staggering words. Why do you trust me? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Arthur looked me straight in the eye. Because you have what the Sterling family lost. Resilience. A true heart. You didn't bow to Roy and Bill's insults. You fought for Ava, and now you're fighting for your son. I see in you the fire I let die out. Then he slid a thick, worn folder across the table. I opened it, my hands trembling, my heart pounding as I scanned the pages. They were classified documents, irrefutable evidence of Gregory embezzling money, setting up shell companies to launder funds, hiding colossal debts, and manipulating stocks. There were records of suspicious accidents, sudden deaths, a journalist who vanished after investigating Sterling Group. Documents showing Gregory bribing officials and rigging politics to cover up his monstrous scandals. A chill ran down my spine, not just at the sheer scale of the crimes, but at the sheer ruthlessness of the man I once called my father-in-law. Arthur explained that he had gathered these documents over years, living in hiding to avoid Gregory's relentless pursuit. The journalists who investigated him all disappeared, he said, his voice lowering to a grave whisper. I stayed silent because I knew I couldn't fight him alone. But you, Darren, you have the drive I lacked. You have Tony, and you have Ava's pain. He paused, letting his words sink deep into my consciousness. I gripped the folder tightly, feeling as if it were burning in my hands. If I do this, I said, my voice trembling but firm, what will I face? Arthur met my gaze, unwavering. True darkness, Darren. Gregory isn't just greedy. He's a predator. He won't hesitate to destroy anyone in his way. But if you don't act, you and Tony will live under his shadow forever. Only by exposing him can your family truly have a future. I sat in silence, my mind reeling. I thought of Tony, the baby who lost his mother at birth. I thought of my parents who had sacrificed their lives for me. And I thought of Ava, her radiant smile, her final, heartbreaking promise, protect Tony. I knew I couldn't turn back. This wasn't just a chance to seek justice for Ava. It was a declaration of war against a dark, corrupt empire. I looked at Arthur and nodded. I'll do it, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. Arthur smiled, a smile filled with hope, but also profound caution. Good. But remember, Darren, this will be a long battle. Once you're in, there's no turning back. We must be careful, and we only have one chance. I left the cafe with that folder tucked tightly in my bag, feeling as if I were carrying a ticking time bomb. Arthur had warned me not to tell anyone, not even my parents, about what he had revealed. Gregory has eyes and ears everywhere, he'd whispered. One wrong word and both of us could disappear just like the others. I nodded, my heart heavy. I wasn't afraid for myself, but I feared for Tony, the baby growing up in my mother's arms, and for my parents, who had sacrificed their lives for me. I knew I had to be more careful than ever. Back home, I quietly hid the folder at the bottom of the wardrobe, inside an old box Ava had used to keep our love letters. Each time I opened it, her delicate handwriting hit me like a wave, and the pain threatened to overwhelm me. But now, that pain no longer brought me to my knees. Instead, it fueled me. Arthur and I began meeting regularly, always in discreet locations, a secluded park, a small diner on the outskirts of town, an old, rarely visited library. He taught me how to cover my tracks, how to communicate without leaving a trace. Gregory is no fool, he said during one meeting in the park, as we sat on a wooden bench, pretending to be strangers discussing the weather. He has an entire network, lawyers, officials, even people in law enforcement. If we act rashly, he'll crush us before we can even speak. I listened intently, absorbing every word. Arthur explained that the documents he had given me were only copies, internal records he had painstakingly collected over years. They were enough to cause a stir, but lacked the legal weight to hold up in court. We need the originals, he said, his eyes sharp and resolute. And we need living witnesses, people who worked for Gregory, who saw his crimes firsthand. But they're scared, Darren. They know what happens to those who dare to stand against him. I thought about his words, about the journalists who disappeared, the suspicious accidents detailed in the folder. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I refused to let fear take over. So, what do we do? I asked, my voice steely. Arthur leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We strike from the shadows. Step by step, we'll undermine Gregory's credibility, make shareholders doubt him, turn public opinion against him. When the time is right, we'll deliver the decisive blow, the original evidence and witnesses. But first, we have to find them, and convince them to stand with us. Arthur's strategy was far from simple. This wasn't a straightforward lawsuit. It was a long, grueling war, requiring patience and cunning. I, a guy from the Bronx who had only ever known hard work and integrity, now had to learn to move in the shadows, conceal my intentions, and outwit an enemy 100 times more powerful than me. Arthur began guiding me into his world, a world of secret connections and meticulously calculated plans. He introduced me to a few people he called allies in the dark. There was a former accountant from Sterling Group, fired after uncovering shady transactions, now living under an assumed name. There was a journalist who had investigated Sterling Group and narrowly escaped death in a sudden car accident. She now lived in hiding but still held onto critical documents she hadn't dared to publish. And there were others, former employees, betrayed business partners, each holding a piece of the truth. These meetings always took place in secret, often at night, in places no one would suspect. I learned to vary my routes daily, to check for tales. Each time I left the house, I kissed Tony's forehead as he slept soundly in his crib and whispered, "I'll do this, son, for your mom." My mother noticed the tension in my eyes, but didn't ask questions. She only hugged me, saying, "Be careful, Darren. I believe in you." My father was quieter, but I knew he worried for me, a silent weight on his shoulders. Arthur and I began building our plan. We couldn't sue Gregory yet, he explained, because the evidence wasn't strong enough, and his powerful network would ensure any lawsuit was buried. To take down a predator, Arthur said, his eyes sharp, you can't miss. We have one shot, and it has to hit the heart. I looked into the darkness ahead and told myself, this is only the beginning. During a strategy discussion in an old, dusty library, Arthur laid out the first move. We can't attack head-on. Gregory has too many allies. We have to strike from within, catch him off guard, and make him expose his own weaknesses. I nodded, gripping a book tightly. So, what's the first step? Arthur gave a sharp, cold smile. We leak a portion of the documents, just enough to stir unease, but not enough for him to trace it back to us. The press will be our first weapon. They'll do part of the work for us, putting pressure on Sterling Group. That night, I returned home and held Tony in my arms. The baby slept soundly, his tiny lips pursed as if lost in a sweet dream. I kissed his forehead and whispered, I'll do this, Tony. I'll give you the future your mother dreamed of. Then I sat down, opened my old laptop, and got to work. Arthur had provided me with an encrypted communication channel, a way to anonymously send information to a journalist he trusted, someone who had nearly lost their life investigating Sterling Group. I selected a document from the folder, an internal report about a shell company Gregory used for money laundering, along with a few notes about suspicious transactions. I didn't sign my name, didn't leave any trace. When I hit send, my heart pounded as if I had just fired the first shot in a war. A few days later, I saw the results. A small article appeared in a reputable financial newspaper with the headline, Sterling Group, is there something shady in their financial reports? The article didn't name Gregory directly, but it cited figures from the document I had sent, raising uncomfortable questions about the company's transparency. I read it in the corner of my parents' kitchen, feeling a surge of adrenaline. For the first time, I felt like I was no longer a victim. I was fighting back. But Sterling Group's response came faster than I expected. Gregory, backed by his formidable PR team, immediately held a press conference. I watched it on TV while my mother cradled Tony in the living room. Gregory, in an expensive suit, stood before the microphones, his voice smooth as a seasoned politician's. These allegations are baseless, he said, his eyes cold and piercing. This is nothing but a ploy by competitors to undermine the confidence of our shareholders and clients. Sterling Group has always been transparent and committed to its values. Roy and Bill stood stiffly behind him, nodding like puppets, but I could see the tension, the barely concealed panic in their eyes. Arthur called me right after, his voice excited but cautious through a secure line. You did well, Darren, he said. This is just the first stone thrown into the lake. The ripples will spread, but we must be patient. Don't let them trace it back to you. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. They won't find me, I said, my voice resolute, laced with a new kind of confidence. But deep down, I knew danger was closing in, a shadow lengthening with every step we took. In the days that followed, the ripples began to spread. Smaller shareholders of Sterling Group, those outside Gregory's iron-fisted control, started asking uncomfortable questions. A few more articles appeared, digging deeper into the irregularities in the financial reports. The media began to take notice, and I saw Sterling Group's name in headlines with increasing frequency. Arthur and I stayed hidden, watching from afar like shadows in the dark. Each time we met, I learned more about covering my tracks and sending information without leaving clues. But my life was still far from easy. I continued working odd jobs, racing against time to provide for Tony and my parents. Some nights after returning from a shift, I sat by Tony's crib, watching him sleep peacefully, and felt a creeping fear. I was taking on an empire, and if I failed, it wouldn't just be me who suffered. My entire family would pay the devastating price. But then I thought of Ava. The way she held my hand and said we'd overcome everything. I remembered Arthur's words, "We only have one shot." And I told myself I couldn't stop. I continued leaking documents, small pieces at a time, like drops of water slowly overflowing a glass. A report about a secret loan, an internal email revealing Gregory's bribery of an official. Each document was a bullet fired from the shadows, aimed at the heart of Sterling Group. I didn't know if Gregory suspected anything yet, but I could feel the tension in the air, a sense of impending confrontation. Once while passing a newsstand, I saw Roy on the front page with the headline, "Sterling Group Chairman's Son Suspected in Fraud." I stopped, my heart racing, and bought the paper. The article didn't mention me or Arthur, but I knew we were shaking their empire to its core. Arthur and I met again in a small diner on the outskirts of town. He looked at me, his eyes a mix of pride and worry. "You're doing well," he said. "But from now on, things will get more dangerous. Gregory won't sit idly by." I nodded, my hands clenched under the table. "I'm ready," I replied, though a formless fear still stirred within me. "I won't stop until they pay for what they did." As a series of articles continued to be published, the atmosphere at Sterling Group began to shift. I no longer worked there, but through the few old friends I had left, I heard whispers of profound unease. Shareholders started raising questions at meetings, demanding explanations for the suspicious figures in the financial reports. Gregory, with his formidable team, tried to extinguish the flames with polished statements and lofty promises. But Arthur and I didn't stop. We knew the articles alone weren't enough. We needed a chain of relentless strikes, each one stronger than the last, to keep Sterling Group reeling. I began working more closely with a small group of journalists Arthur trusted. They were people who had been threatened by Sterling Group, carrying both fear and determination in their hearts. One of them, Anna, had nearly lost her life in a car accident she believed Gregory had orchestrated. With her short, silver-dyed hair and resolute eyes, she became the leader in publishing our documents. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time," she said when we met in a small Brooklyn apartment where she lived under an assumed identity. "But Darren, you have to understand that once we do this, there's no turning back. Gregory will come after us." I nodded, my heart pounding, a cold certainty settling over me. "I know." Then one morning, I turned on the TV and saw Sterling Group's name plastered across every news channel. A major newspaper had released a series of investigative articles with the headline, "Sterling Group Scandal, Corruption and Cover-Ups at the Pinnacle of Power." The article cited testimony from a former employee in the accounting department who had witnessed Gregory manipulating figures to hide debts. This was the person Arthur had convinced to come forward under the promise of anonymity. A media storm erupted. Articles sprang up like mushrooms after rain, from financial journals to national news outlets. Each day brought new revelations: a shell company exposed, a suspected bribe to an official, a major partner pulling out of a deal with Sterling Group over scandal concerns. The company's stock price began to plummet. And I heard that major shareholders were holding secret meetings, demanding urgent answers from Gregory. On social media, the news spread like wildfire, with thousands sharing articles and questioning the company's transparency. Meanwhile, witnesses who had once stayed silent began to speak out. Another former accountant, fired by Gregory for refusing to sign off on a falsified report, contacted Anna and provided even more damning evidence. A former business partner of Sterling Group, betrayed by Gregory in a deal, appeared on a television program, publicly criticizing the company. And then something I hadn't expected happened. A journalist who had disappeared after investigating Sterling Group turned out to be alive. She appeared in an anonymous interview, recounting how she had been threatened and forced to go into hiding. These stories, each a small, crucial piece of the puzzle, came together to form a clear, undeniable picture of Gregory Sterling's monumental greed and ruthless corruption. The pressure from public opinion grew immense. Major partners of Sterling Group began canceling contracts, fearing association with the escalating scandal. Panicked shareholders sold off their stocks, causing the company's market value to plummet into freefall. Arthur and I remained anonymous, letting the press do its vital work. Each time I saw Gregory's name on the news, I felt a small, fierce piece of justice being served. But I also knew we were entering the most dangerous phase. Gregory wouldn't sit idly by and watch his empire crumble. He would strike back, and when he did, Arthur and I had to be ready. In the days that followed, the news was dominated by reports about Sterling Group, with increasingly sharp headlines: Sterling Group scandal, is this the fall of an empire, or Chairman Gregory Sterling faces pressure from shareholders and investigators? I sat in my parents' small kitchen, my eyes glued to the TV screen, a knot of anticipation and dread tightening in my stomach. I knew Gregory was hunting relentlessly for the person behind the leaks. Once I received a chilling message from an old friend at Sterling Group, warning me that Roy and Bill were interrogating every employee and had even hired private investigators to trace the source of the documents. "Be careful, Darren," the message read. "They're furious." My heart raced as I read it. Then I deleted it immediately, leaving no trace, no breadcrumbs for them to follow. The major shareholders of Sterling Group, once blindly loyal to Gregory, began to waver. They no longer trusted his smooth promises or the polished speeches from his PR team. An extraordinary shareholders' meeting was called, and this time, it wasn't under Gregory's control. Arthur received word from an old ally on the board, a man who had worked with him in the early days of Sterling Group. "They're losing faith," he told me during a meeting in a small diner, his eyes gleaming with a fierce hope. "The shareholders want to act to save the company. This is our chance, Darren." We began preparing for the final, decisive blow. Arthur reached out to his allies, those betrayed by Gregory, to gather more original evidence, signed contracts, undeniable emails, and even recordings from a former assistant who had secretly taped Gregory's insidious meetings. I worked day and night, reviewing every document, ensuring no mistakes, no loopholes for Gregory to exploit. On the day of the shareholders' meeting, Arthur and I stayed away. We couldn't show our faces or let Gregory know we were behind it all, not yet. Instead, we sent the original documents to Anna. With a courage I couldn't help but admire, she passed them to a group of major shareholders and an independent investigative agency. As the meeting began, the atmosphere in Sterling Group's grand conference room was like a powder keg ready to explode. I watched the meeting live through a secret, encrypted link Anna provided. Gregory stood at the podium, trying desperately to maintain his composure, but I could see the tension, the desperation in his eyes, a thin veil over his usual arrogance. The shareholders, usually silent and compliant, now stood up, confronting him with pointed, accusatory questions. An older man representing a major investment fund held up a stack of documents, the very evidence we had sent. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice ringing through the silent, tense room, "how do you explain these illicit funds? The shell companies? The bribes recorded in your own emails?" The room erupted in whispers and stunned glances. Roy and Bill, seated beside their father, turned visibly pale, their false composure crumbling. Gregory tried to respond, his voice trembling, but still laced with arrogant denial. "This is slander," he declared, losing his composure entirely. "These documents are fabricated, spread by competitors to bring me down." But no one believed him anymore. Another shareholder stood and played a recording, Gregory's unmistakable voice, coldly discussing a bribe to an official to cover up a previous scandal. The room fell silent, stunned. The only sound was Gregory's ragged breathing, amplified through the microphone. Then something I hadn't anticipated happened. A major shareholder, once a close ally of Gregory's, stood up and proposed a vote of no confidence. "We cannot let Sterling Group collapse because of one man's greed," he said, his voice resonating with indignation. "I move to remove Gregory Sterling and his two sons from the board immediately." A terrifying pause, then a roar of AYE. Loud and resolute, filled the hall. I felt a rush of adrenaline, a profound sense of vindication, unable to believe what was unfolding before my eyes. Gregory tried to shout, to regain control of the furious crowd, but no one listened anymore. The vote happened quickly. The results were announced. Gregory, Roy, and Bill Sterling were removed from the board. A temporary board was formed, pledging full cooperation with investigators to uncover every scandal. His empire was crumbling, spectacularly, before his very eyes. Gregory and his family were now under intense scrutiny. Investigative agencies swooped in, combing through every transaction, every account, every email to trace the embezzlement, money laundering, and financial fraud we had exposed. I imagined Gregory's face, once arrogant and untouchable, now facing suspicious stares and unavoidable questions. In the days following the shareholders' meeting, the atmosphere in New York seemed to tremble with the storm we had unleashed. The press was relentless, churning out story after story. Meanwhile, Gregory, Roy, and Bill were summoned before investigative agencies, and I heard they had hired a team of high-priced lawyers to salvage their reputation. But this time, no one could cover up the truth. The evidence we provided, emails, forged contracts, recordings, was too clear, too sharp to be dismissed. Another shareholders' meeting for Sterling Group was scheduled. And this time, Arthur decided it was time for us to step forward, to finally emerge from the shadows. "This is our chance to close the past," he said, his voice low but powerful. "I'll tell my story, and you'll tell yours. They need to know who's behind all this." I clenched my fists, feeling as if I stood at a fateful, irreversible crossroads. The meeting took place in a grand Manhattan conference hall with gleaming glass walls, an atmosphere as tense as a courtroom. Arthur and I arrived early, standing in a corner, observing the crowd of shareholders, reporters, and members of the interim board. Gregory, Roy, and Bill were conspicuously absent, under investigation, and barred from attending. As the meeting began, a few longtime shareholders immediately noticed Arthur. Though he had left the company years ago, and his name seemed relegated to mere memory, the legend of Sterling Group's founder still lingered in whispers. Suddenly, a prominent shareholder stepped up to the podium, his voice booming through the hall. "Today, we are honored to have the presence of the man who founded Sterling Group. Many of you may never have met him, but he is a living legend among us. Please welcome Mr. Arthur Sterling to say a few words." Arthur walked to the podium with measured steps, an elderly man radiating quiet dignity, his eyes sharp, his voice resonant. "I am Arthur Sterling," he declared, and the hall fell silent. A few people whispered, recognizing the legendary name. "I was betrayed by my own family, pushed out of the company I built by my son, Gregory Sterling. But today, I return to tell the truth about his crimes, about the greed that has tarnished Sterling Group's legacy." He recounted his story, how he was tricked into signing away his shares, slandered, and isolated. He spoke of his years in hiding, meticulously gathering evidence, waiting for the chance to reclaim justice. The hall was quiet, the only sound Arthur's powerful, emotional voice. Then he looked at me, his eyes signaling. "But I didn't do this alone," he said, his voice rising, drawing every eye to me. "There is a young man who lost everything because of the Sterling family, yet still rose to fight. Darren Banner, please come forward." I stepped onto the podium, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. All eyes were on me. It felt like the world was watching. "I am Darren Banner," I said, my voice trembling at first, but growing steady and strong with each word. "I was once an employee of Sterling Group, humiliated by Gregory Sterling and his sons for my humble background. I loved Ava Sterling, and she sacrificed everything to give us our son, Tony. But the Sterling family took her from me, took my job, and tried to take my son's future." I told my story, about my profound love for Ava, the Sterling family's vicious opposition and cruel retaliation, her tragic, heartbreaking death, and the months I lived in soul-crushing despair. I spoke of our desperate fight in the shadows, the documents Arthur and I had leaked, the brave witnesses who had finally come forward. I didn't do this out of hatred, I said, looking directly at the crowd, my voice raw with conviction. I did this for justice. For Ava. For my son. And for everyone the Sterling family has trampled underfoot. The hall erupted in thunderous applause. Tears streamed down my cheeks, not from sadness, but because for the first time, I felt I was no longer alone. The shareholders, once silent under Gregory's reign, now stood, voicing their support, their gratitude. The press captured every word, every emotion, and I knew our story, Arthur's and mine, would spread far and wide. We were no longer shadows. We were victors. I knew that somewhere, Gregory, Roy, and Bill were watching the meeting on a screen, and I imagined their faces, stunned, furious, realizing that the one who brought down their seemingly untouchable empire was me. Darren Banner, the penniless pauper they once mocked and dismissed. Arthur's honor was not just restored, it was elevated. He was invited to rejoin the board as an honorary advisor, but he gracefully declined, looking at me with a proud, knowing smile. You're the one who should lead, Darren, he said. You have the heart and the ability Sterling Group needs now. In a truly surprising and humbling decision, the board offered me a position on the new leadership team as CEO. I was stunned, unable to believe that I, a guy from the poor streets of the Bronx, had been recognized, truly seen, and given this monumental trust. After my appointment, I moved my parents to a new home. Not extravagant, but comfortable enough for them to live without worrying about medical bills or a leaky roof ever again. Tony, my little boy, began growing up in a loving, stable environment, with better care and nourishment than I could have ever dreamed of providing before. My mother still told him bedtime stories every night, and in those quiet moments, my heart was warmed beyond measure, full to bursting with gratitude and peace. Each morning when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw a broken man with dark circles under his eyes. Instead, I saw a father, a son, and a man who had fought relentlessly for justice, who had kept his sacred promise. I had kept my promise to Ava, to Tony, and to myself. But more importantly, I wanted to send a message to everyone still struggling in the shadows, feeling invisible, feeling crushed. Hold fast to your integrity. Stay resilient. Never, ever give up. Justice may come late, but if you keep fighting, if you keep believing, if you refuse to let them break your spirit, it will find you. So, what do you think? Have you ever had to fight against impossible odds, against someone far more powerful than you? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your stories.